They came in the spring of 1986. Soldiers, miners, firefighters, doctors, engineers, farmers, students. They came from across the Soviet Union, from Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, from Kazakhstan and Georgia and Azerbaijan. They came because they were called, because they were ordered, because someone had to go. They were called liquidators. The word sounds clinical, technical, as if they were cleaning up a chemical spill or managing an industrial accident. But what they did was more than that. What they sacrificed was everything. Close your eyes. Let us remember them tonight. The forgotten heroes. The men who walked into radiation to save millions. The men whose names have been erased from history even as their bodies bear the scars of what they endured. In the days after the explosion at Reactor 4, the Soviet government faced a terrifying reality. The reactor core was exposed. Radiation was spreading across Europe. And beneath the shattered reactor, 2,000 tons of uranium and graphite were melting, burning through the concrete, seeking the water below. If the molten core reached the cooling pools, the steam explosion would be catastrophic. If it reached the water table, the Pripyat River would be contaminated. The Dnieper, the Black Sea. Millions of people would be poisoned. They needed men, thousands of men, hundreds of thousands of men, men who would go where no one should go, men who would do what should not be asked. First were the firefighters. At 1:25 in the morning on April 26, the alarm sounded at fire station number 2 of the Chernobyl plant. Anatoly Zakharov was on duty that night. He had worked at Chernobyl since 1980. It had been 6 uneventful years, routine calls, small fires, nothing serious. But when he arrived at the reactor building and saw chunks of graphite scattered across the asphalt, he knew there was only one place that graphite could have come from. The reactor core itself. The firefighters climbed onto the roof. Flames leapt 600 feet into the air. The heat was intense. The smoke was thick and black, and the radiation was lethal. They did not know this. They wore their regular firefighting gear. They picked up pieces of graphite with their bare hands, throwing them off the roof. Each piece delivered a dose that would kill them, but they did not know. They fought the fire for hours. They saved the other reactors from catching fire. They prevented an even greater catastrophe. And then they began to die. Lieutenant Vasily Ignatenko was 23 years old. He was one of the first firefighters on the scene. When he came home that morning, his skin was already turning red. His wife, Lyudmila, was pregnant. She watched him deteriorate over the days that followed. He was taken to Moscow, to Hospital Number 6, the special facility for radiation victims. Lyudmila followed him there. What she witnessed would haunt her forever. The radiation destroyed him from the inside out. His skin peeled off in sheets. His organs failed one by one. He swelled up like a barrel, his body retaining water it could no longer process. In the end, he was unrecognizable. She held his hand despite being told not to touch him. She whispered to him, she loved him, and she watched him die on May 13th, just 17 days after the accident. 28 men died like this in the weeks following the explosion. Firefighters and plant workers. Their bodies were sealed in lead coffins and buried in concrete grave. The radiation in their bodies was too high for normal burial. Even in death, they were dangerous. But this was only the beginning. The Soviet government mobilized. They called it liquidation. The liquidation of the consequences of the accident. Between 1986 and 1989, 600,000 men were sent to Chernobyl. Some sources say 700,000, others say 800,000. The exact number is disputed because the records were classified, incomplete, destroyed. But the number was enormous. They were soldiers, most of them, conscripts doing their military service. They were told they were being sent to Chernobyl. They were told they would be there for a short time. They were told they would receive medals, bonuses, apartments when they returned. Some of these promises were kept, most were not. The work was unimaginable. The reactor building had to be sealed. The sarcophagus had to be built. But first, the roof had to be cleared. The roof of Reactor 3, adjacent to the destroyed Reactor 4, was covered with radioactive debris, graphite from the core, fuel fragments, chunks of concrete and steel so contaminated they glowed in the dark. This debris had to be removed, or the construction of the sarcophagus could not proceed. They tried robots first, remote-controlled machines sent onto the roof to clear the debris, but the radiation destroyed the electronics within minutes. The robots failed. The cameras went dark. The circuits fried. There was only one option left: men. 3,000 men were sent onto the roof. They were called biorobots, human machines. They wore lead suits that weighed 50 kilograms. The suits were supposed to protect them, but the radiation was too intense. They could work for 90 seconds, 90 seconds on the roof of hell. They would run out, shovel debris into the gaping hole where Reactor 4 once stood, and run back. 90 seconds. Then another man would go, then another, and another. Sergei Mirny was one of them. He later wrote about the experience, the terror of running onto that roof, the clicking of his dosimeter, faster and faster until it was just a constant scream, the weight of the lead suit, the knowledge that every second was taking years off his life. But he went. They all went, because if they refused, they would be court-martialed, because someone had to do it, because the reactor had to be sealed or millions would die. They cleared the roof, 3,000 men, 90 seconds each. They did what the robots could not do. And then there were the miners, 400 men from the Donbass coalfields. Volunteers, they were called, though in the Soviet Union, volunteering was often not a choice. They were told to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4, 136 meters long. They had 15 days to complete it. The heat underground was unbearable, over 40 degrees Celsius. The radiation was lethal. Many of the miners worked naked, the heat too intense for clothing. They dug through sand and clay with hand tools, pushing deeper beneath the burning reactor. They worked around the clock. They slept in shifts. They dug the tunnel in exactly 15 days. The cooling system they were digging for was never installed. The core had stopped melting on its own. The tunnel was filled with concrete to strengthen the foundation. The miners went home. Out of 400 miners from one neighborhood alone, according to Liquidator testimony, only 120 remained alive years later. But they were not told this at the time. They were not told that many of them had received doses that would kill them. They were given a certificate, a medal, a small pension, and they were sent home to die slowly. The liquidators cleaned the entire zone. They buried whole forests. The pine trees near the reactor had turned red from radiation. The Red Forest, it was called. Every tree had to be cut down, every contaminated leaf and needle buried. They dug massive pits and filled them with radioactive soil, then covered them with clean earth. They destroyed and buried hundreds of villages. They shot thousands of pets left behind by evacuees, animals that had become radioactive. They worked without proper equipment, without proper training, without proper information about the dangers they faced. Some wore lead aprons and respirators, others wore only their regular military uniforms. Some units had dosimeters to measure radiation exposure. Others had nothing. Some commanders told their men the truth about the dangers. Others lied, said the radiation was minimal, said there was nothing to worry about. One liquidator later recalled that his commander told them they would receive 2 months in a sanatorium after Chernobyl, a vacation on the Black Sea. They would bathe and sunbathe and rest. They were promised apartments, bonuses, cash allowances. None of it materialized, empty promises. The Soviet government issued a secret decree in 1988. Soviet doctors were prohibited from citing radiation as a cause of death. The decree was signed by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina, who himself had been exposed to high doses of radiation during his time at Chernobyl. When Sherbina died in 1990, his death certificate listed the cause as unspecified. This was the great lie, the great cover-up. Liquidators were dying, dozens, hundreds, thousands, but officially Chernobyl had killed only 31 people. The firefighters and plant workers who died in the immediate aftermath. That was the official toll. Everything else was denied, explained away, attributed to other causes. The liquidators knew better. They watched their friends die. They attended funerals that came too often. They developed cancers at rates far higher than the general population. They suffered from immune disorders, thyroid problems, cardiovascular disease. Their children were born with defects. But when they sought help, when they applied for benefits, they were often denied. The government said their illnesses were not related to Chernobyl. The government said they could not prove the connection. How many died? The number is contested, debated, disputed to this day. The Chernobyl Union, the organization of liquidators themselves, estimates 60,000 dead. 40,000 from Russia, 25,000 from Ukraine, 10,000 from Belarus. The World Health Organization says 4,000. Other estimates range as high as 90,000. The truth is no one knows. The records are incomplete. The deaths have been hidden. The Soviet Union is gone, and many secrets were taken to the grave. What is certain is this: thousands of men sacrificed their health, their futures, their lives to contain the disaster. They prevented a second explosion that would have been even more devastating. They sealed the reactor. They cleaned the zone. They saved Europe from contamination that would have been unimaginable. And then they were forgotten. In Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the liquidators became symbols, heroes of the Soviet Union. But as the years passed, as the Soviet Union collapsed, as new governments took power, the liquidators were pushed aside. Their benefits were cut. Their pensions were reduced. Their health problems were dismissed. They became inconvenient reminders of a disaster the new nations wanted to forget. In Estonia, 4,200 liquidators who lived there campaigned for years just to receive basic support. Under Estonian law, the state was only obliged to help citizens who were descendants of those who lived there before World War II. The liquidators did not qualify. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine did not provide relief to liquidators living abroad. For years, these men were caught between nations, recognized by none, helped by none. Finally, in 2017, Estonia agreed to pay each liquidator €230 per year, a pittance, an insult. The survivors carry scars that cannot be seen. One liquidator, speaking years after the disaster, said he was no longer afraid of death. His friend had died swollen like a barrel, his body retaining water it could no longer process. His neighbor had died too, his body turning black and shrinking until he wore children's clothes. The liquidator did not know how he would die, but he knew it would not be long. His diagnosis left no room for hope. He had been to Afghanistan too, he said. It was easier there, they just shot you. Another liquidator recalled working as a doctor in the zone. His job was not to examine the liquidators, he said. His job was to remove the top layer of radioactive soil and load it onto trucks. Doctors became laborers. Everyone did what needed to be done. They had no instructions, no action plan, just one rule: figure it out on your own. The incompetence was staggering, the lack of preparation, the absence of leadership. The Soviet system that prioritized secrecy over safety, that covered up the disaster for 2 days while radiation spread across Europe, that lied to its own people about the dangers they faced. The liquidators were sent into this chaos. They were young men, most of them in their 20s. They had families, they had futures, and they were told to clean up a disaster that should never have happened, using equipment that did not work, following procedures that did not exist, protecting themselves with gear that provided no protection. And they did it because they were ordered to, because someone had to, because if they did not, millions would die. Lyudmila Ignatenko, the wife of the firefighter who died in May 1986, later asked a question that has no answer. Why are love and death together? Who can explain this to her? She loved her husband. She stayed with him as he died. She held him despite being told not to touch him. And she lost him. And she lost their unborn child, who was born but did not survive, perhaps damaged by the radiation Lyudmila absorbed while caring for her dying husband. This is the human cost of Chernobyl, not just the immediate deaths, not just the cancer statistics, but the lives destroyed, the futures stolen, the families shattered, the men who went to Chernobyl and came back changed, their bodies poisoned, their minds haunted, their spirits broken. Today, the liquidators who remain alive are old men. They gather on anniversaries. They tell their stories to anyone who will listen. They fight for recognition, for proper health care, for compensation that acknowledges what they sacrificed. Some have received medals. Some have been honored by governments, but many have received nothing. They remain forgotten, erased from the official history, ghosts of a disaster the world wants to forget. But we should not forget them. We should remember the bio-robots who cleared the roof, the miners who dug the tunnel, the soldiers who buried the forests, the drivers who transporting radioactive debris, the doctors who became laborers, the engineers who built the sarcophagus, the thousands upon thousands of men who went to Chernobyl and gave everything they had. They were not volunteers, most of them. They were conscripts. They were following orders, But they were also heroes. They did what had to be done. They prevented a catastrophe from becoming an apocalypse. They saved lives they would never know. They sacrificed themselves for strangers across Europe who would never know their names. Tonight we remember them, the liquidators, the forgotten heroes of the fallout, the men who walked into radiation and never came back, at least not the same. The men whose bodies bear witness to their sacrifice even as history tries to erase them. We remember their courage, their duty, their humanity. We remember that they were young once, that they had dreams, that they believed the promises made to them, that they thought they would come home. And we remember that many of them did not. Let us rest now, here in the quiet of remembrance, where the names of the forgotten echo softly in the darkness, and the debt we owe can never be repaid. Sleep well,